Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start broadcasting. So those who are on Zoom will be able to jump on. And as they are jumping on, we will go ahead and see if this didn't work last time, but we'll see if we can get this to also broadcast on Facebook. And sometimes that works. And
wow. I just did my first Facebook Live yesterday, actually.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. How did it go?
It was fun. It was great. It was, yeah, like it was the same kind of thing. And people asked questions on the chat, and it was with Elizabeth Wetmore, who wrote Valentine. Have you read that book?
I haven't read it, but do you know Ann Patchett, who we just talked to last week, just recommended it. So
yeah, she blurbed it. It's a great book. It's really, really good. It's about West Texas and the oil boom of the 1970s, and it's like this women's voices, and it's really good.
That is fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it, especially with that. And I also want to see your interview. So we'll look forward to both of those.
Yeah, it's Women and Children's Bookstore. It says the webinar is now streaming live on Facebook.
Yeah, you never know. There we go.
It's the Women and Children's Bookstore Women and Children First Bookstore in Chicago that hosted it. And so the chat is on their webpage, or is on their Facebook page.
Okay. Well, that is fantastic. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go ahead and get started just so we don't keep anybody too much. I know some people are having their cocktails. Hopefully that was how we originally scheduled this time. Some people are making dinner, and all of those are great things to be doing. If you do have a question, then the chat on Zoom is the way to send it. Or if you happen to have my cell phone, you can text it to me. But otherwise, I will not see the questions on Facebook. So. We are really excited to have Tara Conklin here. Tara's already been a big supporter of Friends of the Winthrop Library in actually multiple occasions, but including an event in Seattle. And that is because I think she feels obligated because she's a friend. And
because I love libraries and I love the Methow. Yes. Lots of reasons.
Exactly. Yes, she loves libraries, loves the Methow. Perfect. But I also, I want to, I actually at various points have forgotten to do a proper introduction. And I want to do an introduction of Tara for a number of reasons. One is, of course, that you're a friend, but also because you have an interesting way that you came to writing. And I think that's interesting to a lot of people who listen as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share a brief bio for Tara. It's a bit more formal, and then we'll turn things over to her, and then we'll have some chances to chat as well. So Tara is a writer and she's a former lawyer, and her first novel, The House Girl, which was published by William Morrow, was a New York Times bestseller, #1 Indie Next Pick, Target Book Club pick, and has been translated into 8 languages. Her second novel, The Last Romantics, was published in February 2019. Also an instant New York Times bestseller, Barnes & Noble Book Club pick, Indie Next Pick, and selected by Jenna Bush Hager as the inaugural read for the Today Show Book Club. I remember when that happened.
That's why. It's quite a surprise.
It's awesome. It's great. Before turning to fiction, Tara worked for an international human rights organization and at corporate law firms in both London and New York. And she was born in the US Virgin Islands, grew up in Western Massachusetts, holds a BA in history from Yale, a JD from the NYU School of Law, and a Master of Law in Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts. And now she lives in Seattle, and she's writing, teaching, and working with private clients on manuscript development. She's also a sought-after speaker. So Tara's amazing in all ways, and I'm going to turn it over to you, since people are here for you and not for me, Tara.
I don't think that's necessarily true, Shannon.
Oh, I hope so.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. And I have been so awed by Shannon and everyone in the Methow who has been joining together to fundraise and build support for a library. I mean, libraries, you know, as any writer will tell you, we are readers first. And every writer started as a kid in a public library in the corner with a book. And I can tell you exactly where the Nancy Drews were in my public library. And then as I got older, you know, I kind of moved around, and there's such important places for communities and for readers and for children and for you know, for everyone. And so I'm really, really pleased to be here. And I love the Met Tao. I hope to get out there sometime soon when I can leave my house.
We'd love to have you when you can leave your house.
I'd love to be out there. I'd love to be anywhere but my house, to be perfectly frank, but the Met Tao especially. All right, so I'm going to read a bit from The Last Romantics. This is my second novel. As Shannon said, it came out last year, and then it came out in paperback in January, and I was lucky enough, I just slid some events in under the wire before everything shut down, but I had a lot more canceled. So it's really a delight to be able to share the book with people virtually. So thank you, Shannon, for inviting me. Here's the cover. Last Romantics. Okay, I'm just going to start at the beginning because that's usually what I read, and I'll watch my timer. I may go into the second section a little bit because this first section is pretty short, but I feel like it's important for the book because it kind of sets the tone, or it sets the stage, and it sets up my principal protagonist, whose name is Fiona Skinner. She is a 102-year-old woman who is a famous poet, and she is addressing a large auditorium. It's the first time in many years that she's spoken. It's likely the last event of her life, and it's a big deal that she is here. It's the year 2079, so I'm putting a protagonist who is my age into the future and thinking of her as this 102-year-old poet. And she is giving this reading, and she opens up the floor to questions, and a young woman rises from the crowd and asks her to explain the inspiration behind her most iconic work, which is a poem called simply The Love Poem. And her answer is my book. And it goes into her family and most importantly, her siblings. She is the youngest of 4 siblings, and this is really sort of it's a family epic about these 4 siblings and their relationships, over how their relationships change over time. So I will start in the year 2079, which is when the book opens. Year 2079. At first, I believed the girl to be an apparition, a ghost. She rose from the crowd in the auditorium and walked to the microphone. I remained very still. For the past 90 minutes, I had been seated on stage to discuss my body of work. As much as I dread large crowds, the event had been a success. The audience was respectful, intelligent, curious. I'd even made them laugh. That joke about the frog, of all things. We heard the sirens only once, a brief wail during which I paused my reading. We all waited, the 1,000 here in the auditorium and the thousands more watching via satellite and DTR. We waited, and then the sirens quieted, and I resumed with my poem. Afterward, the questions, so many questions. My first public event in 25 years. Of course there would be questions, but I was not prepared for the intensity, the thoroughness with which these people had read my work. It still surprises me now, 80 years into this literary experiment, that my words might mean something to anyone other than myself. I am 102 years old and a poet of some renown. My name is Fiona Skinner. When the girl stepped forward, my attention was elsewhere, my energy low. I wondered what snack Henry had waiting for me backstage and hoped it was the candy with the peanut butter in the center, my favorite. My thoughts fixed on other comforts, the tall, soft bed in my house in the mountains, the river stocked with trout, the deep, cold well, the generator with its soothing hum. We never heard the sirens there. No, the nearest town was too far. It was a safe place, our house, a place beyond the reach of politics and rising oceans. At least that's what I chose to believe. It's possible to exist under any number of illusions, to believe so thoroughly in the presence of things you cannot see, safety, God, love, that you impose upon them physical shapes, a bed, a cross, a husband. But ideas willed into being are still ideas and just as fragile. The girl at the microphone was an arresting sight. Slender and tall, a dark bob cut short and sharp to her chin. She looked 18, perhaps 20 years old. Not a girl then, nearly a woman. The crowd was silent. She coughed into her hand. "Miss Skinner," she began, "my name is Luna." "Luna," I said, and my voice caught. My breath stilled. For a moment, I traveled back all those years to a different place and time. At last, I thought, Luna has returned. "Yes, my mother named me after the last lines of the love poem," she said. "Oh, of course." I smiled. Henry had told me about this, the popularity of the name. The love poem had that effect on some readers. They wanted to keep a piece of it. And here was one of those babies, now grown, standing before me, another Luna. The girl's face was half in shadow. I saw a mole high on her right cheek, about the size of a dime, a birthmark, a dark kiss. "My mother always wanted to ask you about the name," Luna continued. "She'd memorized the last pages at school. When my brother and I were little, she'd recite them at dinner if we were feeling down." Her face became soft with the memory. "The love poem meant so much to her. I want to know, for my mother, who was your inspiration? Who was Luna?" The auditorium went still. On stage, the lights had become hot, but a cold spread through me, ice flooding my veins. I shivered. A sweat rose along my hairline. It was a question I'd always refused to answer publicly and privately. Even Henry didn't know the truth. But of course, I should have expected it tonight. Isn't that why I'd agreed to speak one last time? Isn't that why I was here? To finally tell this story. An old regret lodged in my throat, blocking my voice. I coughed. "Luna is the Spanish word for moon, of course," I said. "In the poem itself, there are many metaphors, many symbols that mean different things. I wrote it 75 years ago, my dear. Your mother, you, anyone here, you know what the poem means more than I do now." The Luna standing before me shook her head in frustration. A lock of hair fell into her eyes and she pushed it away. "No, I mean the real woman. My mother always said there was someone named Luna." I straightened my spine and heard the bones crack, a minor internal disruption. I wasn't often put on the spot. At home, I had a gardener, a personal assistant, a housekeeper, a cook. I lived with my second husband, Henry, but I ran the house and gave the orders. Some might say I'm imposing. I prefer to think of it as self-assured. This girl was also self-assured. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the purse of her lips. How to describe the first Luna? I met Luna Hernandez only once, on a night when the wind threw tree branches onto the road and leaves whirled in crazy circles, decades ago, a lifetime ago. That Luna had grown and changed in my mind until I hardly saw her anymore. Were her eyes brown or gray? The mole, was it high on the right cheek or the left? Had it been remorse I saw on her face that night, or merely dismissal? "I wrote a poem about love," I began, addressing the crowd. "But there are certain limitations, there are certain failings. I've always been wary of love, you see. Its promises are too dizzy, its reasons too vague, its origins murkier than mud." Here I heard a chuckle from the audience. "Yes, mud," I called in the direction of the laugh. When I was young, I tried dissecting love, setting it up on a table with a good strong light and poking, prodding, slicing. For years, I believed it possible to identify the crux, the core and that once you found this essential element, you might tend it like a rose and grow something beautiful. Back then, I was a romantic. I didn't understand that there's no stopping betrayal. If you live long enough and well enough to know love, its various permutations and shades, you will falter. You will break someone's heart. Fairy tales don't tell you that. Poetry doesn't either. I paused. You're not answering the question, Luna said. Her arms were now crossed against her chest, her chin down. Let me tell you a story, I said. In these difficult times, stories are important. In a sense, stories are all we have to tell us about the future. Luna moved away from the microphone. She was listening intently. Everyone was, shoulders pitched just slightly forward, curious and alert. Once upon a time, I began, there was a father and a mother and 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy. They lived together in a house like any other house, in a town like many other towns, and for a time they were happy. I paused, and all those faces in the auditorium stared down on me, all those eyes. And then there was the pause. Everything started there. Our mother didn't mean for it to happen. She didn't. But this is a story about the failures of love, and the pause was the first. Okay, I'll read a few more pages from the first section, which is about the pause, a term that in this day and age, many people have been emailing me saying, this is the pause, we're in a pause now. But this pause was one that happened in this family, in Fiona Skinner's family, and when their father dies very suddenly and unexpectedly, and their mother is thrown into the depths of a pretty debilitating depression. So I'll just read a few pages. I'll just watch the clock and see how we're doing.
Wonderful.
Okay, so this is Bexley. The family lives in a fictional town in Connecticut called Bexley. Chapter 1. In the spring of 1981, our father died. His name was Ellis Avery Skinner, 34 years old, a small bald lozenge on the back of his head that he covered every morning with a few hopeful strands. We lived in the middle-class town of Bexley, Connecticut, where our father owned and operated a dental practice. At the moment his heart stopped, he was pulling on a pair of blue rubber gloves while one of his afternoon patients, a Mrs. Lipton, lay before him on the padded recliner, breathing deeply from a sweet mask of chloroform. "Oh," our father said, and toppled sideways to the floor. "Dr. Skinner?" Mrs. Lipton sat up. She was unsteady, groggy, and afraid as she looked down at our father on the floor. He twitched once, twice, and then Mrs. Lipton began to scream. The look on his face, she later reported to our mother, was one of surrender and absolute surprise. Our mother was 31 years old. She'd never held a full-time job and possessed a degree in English literature from Colby College in her home state of Maine that sat unframed in an upstairs closet. Her dark hair hung like 2 pressed curtains framing the window of her face. Her eyes were wide and brown, with sparse lashes and narrow lids that gave an impression of watchfulness and exposure. Her name was Antonia, though everyone called her Noni, and it was decided long before my birth that her children should call her Noni too. The day of our father's funeral was dank, mid-March. Ronald Reagan was president, the Cold War dragged on. Star Wars had made us all believe in forces we could not see. At that time, Bexley was a town where people greeted each other by name at the post office or the bank, and no one cared who had money and who did not. The doctor and the mill worker both visited my father for root canals, and both drank beer at the same drafty tavern. The dark Pinell River meandered along the east side of town and gave us something to do on summer days. This was still the era when a 90-minute commute to New York City seemed absurd, and so the people who lived in Bexley, for the most part, worked in Bexley. It was no surprise then when the whole town turned out for our father's funeral. Hundreds, it seemed to me, thousands. Noni led us through that awful day with an iron grip on 2 of our 8 hands. She alternated. She did not play favorites. She had 4 children, and we all needed to feel the warmth of her palm. Renee, the eldest of us, was 11 years old. Long, thin limbs, chestnut hair she wore in a single braid down her back. Even as a child, Renee exuded competence and self-containment, and at the funeral, she was no different. She did not cry or make a fuss when her tights ran up the back. She helped Noni with us, the younger ones, and tried not to look directly at the casket. After Renee came Caroline, who was 8, and then Joe, who was 7. Caroline was the fairest of us, with cheeks pink as bubblegum and hair that streaked blonde in the summers. Joe was the boy, the only boy, with floppy hands and large feet and a stubborn right side cowlick that he was forever flipping away from his face. Joe and Caroline both had a tawny glow and quick, broad grins, and were mistaken so frequently for twins that sometimes even they forgot there was a year between them. And then came me, Fiona, the youngest, 4 years and 8 months old on the day our father died. I was a pudgy child with soft dimpled knees and unruly reddish hair that frizzed and flamed around my freckled face. My looks contrasted so vividly with those of my lithe, golden siblings that neighbors raised eyebrows, a tilt of the head, a shadow of gossipy doubt passing behind the eyes. Bexley, Connecticut was like that. Working class New Englanders, starched in Puritan ethics. Their nails were dirty, but their souls were clean. After our father's death, the gossip stopped. Widowhood trumped the suggestion of infidelity. In her grief, Noni became infallible, untouchable. I remember very little about my father while he was alive, but the day we buried him, I recall in great detail. At the cemetery, a racket of crows flew above the casket. Our priest, Father Johns, delivered remarks in tones that rose and fell like a fitful storm. I could not understand a word of it. The ground was mushy with thaw, but crusts of snow still lurked beneath trees and along the shadowy side of the marble mausoleum that sat up on a low hill behind the gravesite. The mausoleum resembled a house, front steps, a peaked roof, the appearance of windows. It was so much larger and more impressive than the tidy headstone Noni had chosen for our father's grave. I was more interested in the mausoleum than I was in Father John's, and so I ran away from the funeral, around the back of the crowd and up the hill. The mausoleum stones were a deep gray, speckled with rain spots and age, significant and somber. Along the top, I sounded out the name, Garrison H. Clark, and then beloved father, husband, son, brother, colleague, friend. Down the small hill, Father John spoke in a dull, deep voice. From a distance, finally, I could make out the words. Too soon, great burden, do not ask. Noni's head was bowed. She hadn't noticed my absence. Noni was Catholic and felt it in her knees that ached from all the praying, but not, she realized that day, in her heart. This was the last time she would entertain the rituals of organized religion, the last day she would bow her head to the words of a man wearing white. From my position on the hill, the mourners looked similar to the crows, only bigger and quieter, perched on the yellowish green of the spring grass that cut abruptly to the darkness of earth beside the casket. I thought of how little space there was on our father's stone, how unassuming it was, how meager. Nothing like Garrison H. Clark's showy marble mausoleum. Standing beneath a stranger's name, gazing down at my father's funeral, for the first time that day, I began to cry. That's not a real uplifting place to stop, but I'm looking at the time.
An amazing story, and I haven't read it since it came out, actually. So it's been a couple of years, I guess, right? Since the hardcover. No. Well, I guess a year and a half.
It's been a year and a bit. Yeah.
It's been a year since I've read it, but it brings that all back. And I mean, it's quite an epic story. It really is.
Yeah, I mean, it covers about 100 years, and it just kind of, well, Shannon, it took me a very long time to write, and I had handed it in twice before I've handed it in twice to my editor, and twice my editor said, no, this is not the book we're going to publish. And the third time, I basically went back to the drawing board and, swept everything away and opened a new document and typed chapter 1. And I just started fresh. And at that point in time, I mean, people always groan when I tell that story, but I do think, that time and those 2 previous drafts were necessary for me to find these characters and find this story. So it was all worth it in the end, because I did find them after, a lot of meandering. It was not a straight path. It was very much, cutting back and forth, but I did find them.
So, and I don't know if I've ever asked you this, but how did you decide to start where you did with the scene that you just read with this poet that is many years into the future, and actually there's some references to things that are futuristic in that, but still in the story and what she's going to tell. How did that idea come about?
Yeah, well, it was very late in the game. I mean, I had already been working on this book for probably 4.5 years. And I had always framed it, well, I had these two narrative goals. I mean, the first one was to look at female characters like myself. And I really wanted to make it about contemporary women and men and sort of the issues that plague family and work. And I really wanted it to have that contemporary relevance. But I also wanted to write, the epic, the long game, and look at this family over a long time. And those goals were in opposition. And every time, there was just something wrong with the tone. Like the narrative, Fiona's narrative always had this kind of nostalgic tone to it. But if she was a woman, of my generation, of our generation, she wouldn't have the opportunity to really look back on her life in the way that I wanted her to do. Like, she wasn't old enough yet. And so it just wasn't working in the way that I wanted it to work. And then I literally had this aha, one of those light bulb moments. And I was like, wait a second, what if Fiona is talking to us from the future? And it seemed like I could have my cake and eat it too, right? I could be looking at contemporary characters and contemporary situations, but I could also have this long view and this very kind of taking stock of one's life perspective that Fiona has in the book. And also it was just, and I had never read a book like that before, with a future narrator that wasn't about the future, the future sections are more to kind of set the story. And also I wanted the reader to kind of think okay, what's important in my life, and what are the things when I'm 102 years old, what are the moments and the relationships and the regrets that I will be having. And do that, go through that process without being 102 years old.
Right.
So it was really fun. It was really fun to work on. I really enjoyed the future sections, and I think there might be a full dystopian novel in me sometime down the line. We'll see.
I know you talked about it a few years ago, and I wondered if that was coming. That's right. That's great. Well, did you have a favorite character in all? Because you had to develop a number of characters for this.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't, as your children, so to your characters, you don't really have a favorite. You love them all equally. I will say, though, that Renee, who is the oldest sibling, she was the one that I kind of found the hardest to get. And I felt like she went on the biggest journey over the course of the drafts.
Right.
And like, for example, in the very first draft, she was a Pilates instructor who had no children. And in the book, she is a transplant surgeon who becomes a mother kind of late in life. And so she like when she started off in one place and just really changed. And I think because of that, I have a certain fondness for her. Like, I feel like I really had to dig deep at who she was. And yeah, and also I'm the oldest in my family. So I have I feel a certain affinity for the oldest of a group of siblings. I'm the oldest of 3. Renee's the oldest of 4, but yeah. So I guess if someone was holding a gun to my head, I would probably say Renee, but I love them all.
And you had your own journey from corporate law and human rights law to writing novels, right?
I did, yeah.
Do you want to, we say a little bit about that just for people who are examining their lives or maybe have other aspirations that are yet fulfilled?
I mean, it was, it was very, I mean, I felt like I was always a writer. I was always writing, but I never thought that I could make a living at it. I saw my writing as something that would help me in other professions. And then when I retired from my real job, then I would be able to devote myself in my retirement to writing fiction. And I was very excited about retiring. And when I went to law school, the thing that really appealed to me, and when I was working, before law school for the human rights organizations, was the researching and the writing and building arguments and building cases and really kind of constructing a narrative. And that's what I was always really good at. And so I used those skills in my legal career. And then, but at a certain point, I was working at a big firm, and at a certain point, that kind of researching and writing is considered like the grunt work. Like the partners, the higher you up you go in the chain, like the more you have to like be schmoozing clients, and you have to be, dealing more with business aspects of stuff, which was not what interested me about the practice of law. So, so I was kind of losing interest in the career at the same time that I became a mother. I had 2 kids very close together, and I was working a lot of hours. And I had also started on my first maternity leave, I had started the story that became The House Girl. So I kind of had all of these things going on at once, where I was really finding this character, Josephine Bell, and this story about her that just totally took control of my imagination. And then I was really loving being a mom and realizing that if I continued to be a lawyer, I would never see my children. And I also kind of had this moment where I was like, I'm okay, so I'm a parent now, and what am I going to tell my kids? Like, am I going to tell my kids, okay, yeah, you love to do that, but wait until you retire to actually do it? And I just felt like I was really kind of chickening out in a lot of ways by not trying. Right. So I took what was supposed to be a leave from my legal career of a year, and then it stretched into about 2 years. And I just devoted myself to working on the novel, and then it sold, and knock on wood, I won't have to go back to the law. It's been about 10 years now, so nobody wants me back in the law either.
Well, everyone wants your books though, however, and The House Girl was wonderful as well, and so different, right? Where you, I mean, 2 different stories that really weaved back and forth. How was that different in terms of the writing and kind of holding on to the story than the more kind of epic of The Last Romantics?
I mean, the House Girl was different in so many ways. I mean, as you know, writing your first book is like this, I mean, it's this leap of faith. It's like this total exercise in obsession and irrationality and, like financial suicide. I mean, it's just like this totally crazy thing to do. because no one's waiting for your book, right? Like no one's like setting a deadline for you, or if you don't set it for yourself. So it really was a labor of love, the first novel. And I also didn't say, oh, I'm writing a novel, until I was probably, I don't know, 2/3 of the way into the process. It was always just because I was always writing stories. Like I always sort of had stories on the go, just as a way to sort of entertain myself. And so this started in that way. It was, The House Girl started as just like a story that, and then it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So, and I was kind of embarrassed. Like I didn't tell people for the longest time that I was working on a novel, because I don't know, I felt I was like in the closet, I was like this closet writer. But I mean, in terms of like the logistics of writing it, it was definitely, I wrote each section of The House Girl. There are 4 separate sections, and I wrote each section like from beginning to end on its own, as like these self-contained stories. It was almost like linked short stories, but I didn't even think of them as linked short stories at the time. It was more, oh, and I'm really interested in this character, and oh, I'm really interested in that character. Let's see what that character is up to. And so, yeah, so it was very different. Whereas with The Last Romantics, I knew my editor was waiting for it. I knew that someone was gonna, that it was gonna be a book. And it started, The House Girl really started with a character, whereas The Last Romantics kind of started as an idea. Like I had this idea that I wanted to write about sibling relationships, and about women, and about contemporary women. And so, I think that's one of the reasons why it took so much time to write, because it didn't start with the character. And of course, character is really, the building block of any piece of fiction, or any piece of, I mean, creative nonfiction, I think, as well. But it did start with an idea, and I did know I was writing a book, and I also had the voice of every bad Amazon reviewer, like in my ear. Don't read your Amazon reviews. Actually, Goodreads. I feel like Goodreads there's some, yeah.
Tough book, yeah. So if
there are some tough readers on Goodreads.
If you're watching this, make sure that you are leaving your nicest reviews on all platforms, please, for all authors that you love.
Yeah, just think of the poor writer who's like, oh, I just devoted 4 years of my life to that book, and
That's right. That's right. No, well, they're both incredible, and they're both such unique approaches and unique characters. I mean, they're both just wonderful. I remember picking up The Last Romantics and having loved The House Girl and loved your writing in it, and then picking up The Last Romantics, and I remember actually reading it in bed and turning to my husband and saying, wow, she is really just upped her. I mean, not that you needed to up your game was already up, but it's just, the writing is just beautiful. It really is.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. Really, well, that means a lot coming from a beautiful writer like yourself. Thank you.
So if a dystopian novel is not in the immediate future, what's coming up next? I know you've been working.
I have been working pre-COVID, there's like post and pre and post. I was working on my 3rd novel, which is called Community Board. And it is about a small community in New England. I feel like, I've lived in Seattle for 11 years now, but I grew up in New England, and I still don't feel like I've been here long enough to write a book set here. Like I feel like the imprint of my childhood is still very much, that's what I'm most comfortable writing. Although The House Girl was partially set in the South. Right. But and it was my original vision of the book was sort of my response to the political polarities that emerged during the Trump years. But I wanted to write a political novel without mentioning politics at all. So and having it be funny, because I do feel like so much of what's happened in this country, like, it's just hilarious. I mean, you couldn't, like, if you watched a movie about some of the things that are going on, you would be like, no, this is too unrealistic. However, in the light of COVID, I really have found it very difficult to write. I don't know if you have had, I just feel like there's so much to process about this time, and particularly because I'm writing about a small community, and kind of how they come together despite these polarizing differences that are not political in the novel, but they have sort of political analogs. I've just found it difficult to kind of wrap my head around the project again, because it seems almost irrelevant in some ways, or like this huge piece of it will be missing if I don't talk about COVID, but I don't know what to say about COVID. Who knows what it's going to look like in 2 years, even 2 months. I mean, we don't know. So so my alternative project at the moment is a YA novel that I've been talking to my middle son about, my middle son Luke, and it's about an alien invasion, and yeah, that's all I'm gonna say.
So, what's so interesting about that is, well, first of all, there's been a lot of conversation around this, because there's this idea that, okay, we're all home, we're not traveling as much, so creatives must just be creating like crazy. And the reality is, I think a lot of creatives are feeling like they can't create at all in this time. Yeah. And it's but the other interesting piece is our conversation last week with Ann Patchett. She was mentioning that she was reading middle grade novels right now. So that's a place that she could go as well during this time. And I just think that is, it's interesting to see how this latent, underlying, and sometimes acute stress affects us both creatively and also in what it is that we want to bring into our lives, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely. And I mean, also watching, for me as a parent, I mean, I have 3 kids who are school age, and having them home all the time and having to oversee their Zoom class schedule and getting them to do homework. I mean, it's just very, I'm sure it's very all consuming, and I've also just been very worried about them, and and just how this time will impact them and impact their education, and and how they feel about the world. There's just so much fear and anxiety floating around. So I have found most of my creative energies are going towards them and doing things with them, and but I got to pay the rent, so I'll try. I'm getting, and also I miss writing. I really miss working on a book, and that's kind of one of the reasons why Luke and I started talking about a YA book, but both my older 2 kids are really big readers, and I don't really read that much YA, but I've started too during this time, and and I feel like it would be fun to do with him, and it would be, a fun thing to do.
For sure. Well, in the meantime, all of your readers are anxiously awaiting your next book, so we'll be excited that when that does come around, when it does come to pass. It's great. Well, what would you say to a small community, speaking of small communities, that is on the cusp, hopefully, of bringing a new library to the community, and it's a hard time, right? There's a lot of acute need, and yet we're asking the community to come behind us and to contribute and to make a meaningful contribution, hopefully, to this new library. What would you say to that community as a writer and as a member of a small community from long ago?
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, I guess I would just say, keep your eyes on the long game, right? I mean, this time right now is crazy and unpredictable and full of anxiety, of all different kinds of anxiety, but we'll get through it. Every community will get through this. And whether it's a year or 2 years down the road, but but it will end. I mean, we will get back to regular life. And you know, a library is something that will be there for generations, and will, you know, continue to provide all of these resources, these really, really valuable resources, to everyone in the community for generations. So I think it's obviously very easy to just get so wrapped up in what's happening in the moment and to forget that there will be a time when we can go to the grocery store without a mask on, and we can't, you know, there will come a time, and we want to be thinking about that time, and staying hopeful, and building a future that we want to live in, you know. And
Yes.
certainly for the Methow, I mean, that includes a library for sure.
Absolutely. No, it's something that I love how you told the example of every young writer starting out in the corner of the library, and imagining our young writers that start out here, but also the people that will need the resources for finding jobs or working on their resume,
Yeah.
or doing online courses because they have access to technology. And those are the types of things where we are trying to keep that dream forward, because I think we need that more than ever when we come back.
Yeah. And especially after this time, I mean, I am lucky that I have my children. I think of people who live alone and how isolating this time must be for them.
Exactly.
And, you know, libraries are such a place of coming together and you know, community building and meeting people, and over, you know, and shared interests and classes and all of those things that you're talking about. And there's definitely, I feel like people are so thirsty for connection, you know, even after a couple months of this. And it's only that need, I mean, it's a human need, you know, for connection and community, and it's only gonna increase as we get further into quarantine.
Absolutely. No, you're so right. And that is directly tied in all the studies to resilience, although we all know that just from our own experience too, right? Is that human need for connection is tied to making people healthy, and in every way. So, well, Sarah, thank you for spending time with us tonight.
Yes,
It's really
my
always,
pleasure.
and it's wonderful to see your face. It's wonderful to have a chance to talk about books and what you're working on. And
it's great to see you too, Shannon. Thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully I'll get to see you in the flesh soon.
I hope so as well. We'll always have a space for you. So as soon as it's safe to travel, come.
Yeah.
Come.
Oh, I will.
I know you will. That's good. Great.
Okay. Right. Bye, everybody.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.